Tonight, we're kicking off a 2-hour GBH News special presentation, Election 2020. What's next? Starting with a special edition of Greater Boston. My Boston Public Radio co-host, Margery EAGAN, will join me for the next half hour as we discuss the many challenges that lie ahead. GBH's Adam Reilly would join us for some analysis as well. We'll check in with Harvard Law professor JEANNIE GERSEN on all the many legal challenges we're seeing now and might see going forward in this election. Then later, newly re-elected Senator Ed Markey on what he expects for the future of Congress and the Democratic Party at large. But first, a look at where things stand now. In cities across the country, including battleground states Pennsylvania and Georgia, people have taken to the streets, with some demanding every vote be counted, others calling to stop the count, an echo of Trump's demands over the past few days. Still, the counts are continuing on, and with a handful of states still left uncalled, Joe Biden has the advantage over Donald Trump in the electoral count as of this taping. But both sides are saying they are confident they'll be the ultimate winner. Margery EAGAN joins me now, along with Adam Reilly. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Jim.
Thanks for having us.
So, Adam, starting with you, it's day 3 of election week, and I have to say it has been peaceful and lower volume than I expected. If you agree with that, is this just the calm before the Trump storm, or did we exaggerate the chaos that was going to fall upon us?
I agree with your assessment of how it's been up until now. I think the ultimate answer completely depends on what the president does. If, for example, the race is called for Joe Biden, does he hop on Twitter and urge the bikers for Trump and whoever else for Trump to take to the streets and make their displeasure known? Does he tell the Proud Boys the time has come to, no longer stand by, take action, show that this is unacceptable? Or does he exercise restraint, which is something that over the course of his presidency, we almost never see him do? That being said, he's been really restrained by his standards the past 3 days. So it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I don't think we'll know the answer until we see the president respond if things go against him.
Do you know the answer, Margery?
Well, I certainly don't know the answer, but I do know that you got to give the president this. He inspires tremendous passion and loyalty, and he's got people out at rallies willing to go out there and stand in the cold when the buses are slow and, shout fire Fauci and shout lock her up and stuff like that. So the level of attachment to this man as a politician is enormous. So I don't know what will happen if he loses and millions of people think that he lost because of cheating.
My take on this is, and I'm not any more confident than either of the two of you are about what happens. If Joe Biden just gets to 270, if he wins Nevada and Arizona, which gets him exactly to the threshold, then I think the potential for all hell to break loose is there. If he also picks up Georgia, if he also picks up Pennsylvania and crosses the 300 electoral vote threshold, I think the ability for even Donald Trump to summon the troops, Adam, as you described a minute ago, is somewhat limited. Am I being naive around that, or no?
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. He's a guy who likes things to be done decisively, done with great magnitude. You like to brag about his victory over Hillary Clinton last time around in the Electoral College, even though he lost the popular vote. So I think you're right. Maybe despite himself, if it's a fairly big margin in the Electoral College, that just might tamp down his bluster, which I think would be really good for the country. And, if it goes the other way, I don't know if there's a mathematical scenario for it to be more than, Trump just hitting 270 or going a little over. But as a country, we could use a little chance to catch our breath here.
Speaking of that, Margery, catching our breath, maybe this is pathetically naive. You and I talk all the time, but I am so sick of having, what do you call it, Trump running a superhighway through your head or whatever expression
four
you
lane
use.
superhighway right through your head. That's right.
I am sick of the endless partisanship on everything. Let's assume Joe Biden does carry the day. Does he have the skills? Does his party have the skills to at least broker some sort of healing in this country? I don't know what the right words are. You know what I mean? At least an end to the nonstop screaming and partisan divide, or no?
Jim, you and I disagree a little bit about this, but I think that Fox News and so-called Trump media is a danger to the United States of America. I think they tell lies on a regular basis. You had Sean Hannity this week before, and he's the top-rated guy there, got a huge radio show telling people they should be outraged and furious and angry. And this is before we got very far in the whole post-election process. So when you have people revving up this kind of anger, I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard.
Adam, everybody knows you're a much nicer person than I am, so I assume that you obviously would like to see a little bit of America coming together. Is it in the cards, or is this just going to continue for years and years, Trump or no Trump?
Like you, I would love to see it, but I'm thinking of, and tell me, I'm probably going to get his name wrong, newly elected Republican Congressman Madison Cawthorn. Am I getting it right? He celebrated his election the other night on Tuesday by tweeting, "Cry more, libs."
Yeah.
That was the way that he marked his entrance to Congress. We've got Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, the first, I believe, QAnon adherent going to Congress. You know, QAnon obviously believes that there's a cabal of Democrat satanic pedophiles that needs to be stopped, maybe by violent means. So I don't know if anyone could do what you would think Biden could, because he's this sort of genial, avuncular presence. He's very moderate, but that didn't stop him from being labeled, a front for creeping socialism. So I hope so, but I, like Marjorie, am pessimistic.
We only have a minute left here, and I'm never in the same room with either of you anymore, even though Marjorie and I do a radio show. How's your state of mind as an American citizen, Adam, not as a journalist right now? Quickly.
My state of mind isn't great. You guys know I have a couple kids who are, in the double digits, and it is really worrisome to me to see them coming of age in a country that seems as radically and deeply split as we are right now. It makes me wonder, what kind of country they're going to inherit if they stick around here.
How about it, Marjorie?
I am very despondent. I think I was stunned that more Americans did not repudiate Donald Trump for all the reasons we've talked about. I don't know how you explain that. I'm disappointed in my fellow white women who voted for him in the majority. I mean, what do you tell your children? I don't know.
On that note, Marjorie, stick around. Adam, it's a pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Jim.
See you. As many expected, the lawsuits have been coming fast and furious from the Trump campaign as the week's gone on top of plans to demand a recount in Wisconsin, which is well within their rights. They've filed suits in 4 states so far: Pennsylvania, Nevada, Michigan, and Georgia, although a judge in Savannah quickly dismissed that last suit, which accused local election officials in the surrounding county of mixing in ballots that arrived on time with ones that missed the state's deadline of 7 p.m. on Election Day. This afternoon, a Michigan judge also denied the campaign's request to halt ballot counting until they could get more access to observe the process. A Pennsylvania judge ruled on a similar lawsuit this morning as well, allowing GOP observers to watch all aspects of ballot processing. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign has also sued Pennsylvania's Secretary of State for extending the deadline for some first-time voters to provide ID that would let them vote by mail. They've also asked to join a lawsuit that's already before the Supreme Court, looking to overturn that state's mail-in ballot extension. And in Nevada, the campaign is claiming as many as 10,000 votes came from people who are either deceased or no longer live there. The president summed up his strategy on Twitter this morning, saying, "All of the recent Biden-claimed states will be legally challenged by us for voter fraud and state election fraud. Plenty of proof." But is there? We're joined now by JEANNIE Gersen. She's a professor at Harvard Law School and a contributing writer at the New Yorker magazine. JEANNIE, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Now, there have been a multitude of lawsuits, as I just described. I think you called it a legal cacophony, some of which have already been dismissed. But are any of these lawsuits that have been filed so far, at least, are they potential outcome changers or not?
So far, it doesn't look like they are. I would sum it up as a strategy of throwing a lot of things up in the air. And the purpose of it is not necessarily even that one of them is going to work. It's that the plentiful nature of all of these suits means that people then have some doubts about whether there actually was fraud.
You know what's incredible, I think, to a lot of voters? This year, there were so many mail-in votes. People followed the rules, got their ballots, went through the whole procedure, carefully filled them out, got them in on time. played by the rules, like I said, and now they're having politicians change the rules, not just in the middle of the game, but after the game. Is that, how is that okay? What are voters supposed to make of that?
Well, I think voters should be concerned that their votes might not be counted, even if they followed all the rules. There's a very strong reliance interest, and I think the law takes that very seriously. Judges take that very seriously. So the hope is that if it comes down to it, if there is a state that really is going to tip the balance for one candidate or another, then that a judge would recognize that you can't say to voters who followed all the rules that states gave them that their vote is not going to be counted. And right now, that is a Republican argument that perhaps could go to the Supreme Court if, say, Pennsylvania were the key state.
So, Jeannie, I'm sorry, Marjorie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think that's going to happen, that we're going to wind up with a Bush v. Gore situation, different, but in some ways right before the Supreme Court again?
I think the chances of that go up if there really is one state that has this issue of, say, the votes that are being counted after Election Day, where Republicans think that anything that arrived after Election Day through the mail should not be counted, because that's an issue that the Supreme Court, 3 justices have signaled that they're open to that and open to throwing out votes based on that argument.
You know, Jeannie, the thing, Marjorie and I on the radio, and I here have spoken to a lot of legal scholars about the potential for an outcome changer to end up before the Supreme Court, a la Bush v. Gore, which you and Marjorie were just discussing. And the answer is always given within fairly strict legal confines. Is there a case that merits the Supreme Court taking it, that they could potentially rule for a Donald Trump, for example? And the reason I don't understand that criterion is, let me read to you, I'm sure you've memorized this, from Judge Kavanaugh in a recent 5-3 decision on Wisconsin and the counting of absentee ballots. Here's what he said. Those states want to avoid the chaos and suspicions of impropriety that can ensue if thousands of absentee ballots flow in another election day and potentially flip the results of an election. As I'm sure you know, the former dean of Harvard Law School, who's now in the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan, said, flip the results of an election. There are no results of an election until you've counted all the votes. He's essentially echoing almost word for word what the President of the United States said. If a justice is willing to, in my opinion, bend the law to accommodate his end game, his goal, why do we assume that in a 6-3 majority that they're not going to do whatever they got to do to reelect Donald Trump if the opportunity is presented to them?
Well, I think the problem here is this very hard distinction that you or others are leaning on, which is, oh, there's the law, and then there's how you frame
Exactly.
the legal issue. And in fact, what Justice Kavanaugh was doing in those words that you read was framing the legal issue in a certain way. He's kind of getting out ahead of it even before the votes have been counted. And that I do think that was a very unwise thing to do. And it definitely shaped the way that current officials, Republicans, are talking about the matter.
Well, the other thing that's also very frightening to people, particularly people that are on voted for Biden, is this notion that legislatures can overrule the will of the people and have their electors go elect Trump, even if people there voted for Biden. How is that okay, and how does that work?
That is a very, very fringy argument. I don't expect that to carry the day, but some people will resort to that. Some people will try to resort to that if it turns out that that's the only way for their candidate to win. But we are right now focused on counting the votes. But just one thing to note is that after the votes are counted, as contested as they are, there are still further hurdles after the vote counting. There's this selection of the electors, as you mentioned. There is the verification, the certification of the results, and then there's Congress's decision on what to do after counting the votes and how to count the votes. And so all of those are moments in which all kinds of arguments can be made, and so chaos.
So why do you call that fringy? If it turns out, my understanding is it's constitutionally permissible, feel free to disabuse me, for a Republican legislature to say, okay, the people voted for Joe Biden in our state, but there was so much fraud in our judgment that we will pick electors who support the real winner, in quotes, of our vote had there not been fraud, Donald Trump. Why do you suggest that is fringy?
I don't suggest that it's fringy to throw out results based on fraud, actual fraud. But it is fringy to say, regardless, legislatures get to pick who our electors will be. It is true that fraud is a basis for negating certifications, for Congress to say we're not going to count the electoral votes the way they came in. So that lies ahead, given that the president has been sounding that fraud alarm. I do think that he will probably pursue it all the way to the end.
You know, before you go, Jeannie, you wrote a piece for The New Yorker that was talking about court packing or court expansion that seems to be a moot point right now. But you end the piece quoting FDR, who said he wanted an independent judiciary. And here's the quote: "But it does not mean a judiciary so independent that can deny the existence of facts which are universally recognized." What did he mean, and what did you mean?
So I think that when we think about judicial independence, we mean independence from the political branches. That's centrally what we mean, that they're independent of partisan concerns and of concerns by the executive branch and the Congress and the states. They have to be independent of all of those branches and those concerns. But I think what FDR meant was we don't want them to be so independent that they basically have lost touch with reality, facts on the ground, and just the things that actually make this a country that is guided by the rule of law.
And maybe what the American people really want, despite the conservative
majority. And that is
majority.
absolutely the most important idea.
Jeannie Sue Gersen, it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much for giving us your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, he's been in Congress for 44 years, and the voters of Massachusetts are sending Senator Ed Markey back for 6 more after a decisive win Tuesday night. But while most believed yesterday that the balance of power in the Senate would remain essentially unchanged, it turns out Georgia may be playing double spoiler. One Senate race there will be heading to a runoff in January, and as of this taping, the other race there might as well, which would offer a possible path for the Democrats to take the Senate in a tie. That is, if there's a Vice President Harris who would act as a tiebreaker. Senator Ed Markey joins us now. Senator, congratulations on your win.
Thank you, Jim. Great to see you and Marjorie. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank
Pleasure.
you. And congratulations as well, Senator Markey. So
Thank you.
one of the pieces of good news in this election is that there was a huge turnout all across the country of 18 to 34-year-olds. What do you think that was about?
Well, you know, we saw in the Democratic primary in Massachusetts, we saw a 50% increase in 18 to 34-year-old votes from 2018 to 2020, a 50% increase. It went from 12% of the total vote to 19% of the total vote in Massachusetts from 2018 to 2020. So we think that is something that actually occurred as a larger trend across the whole country on election day, and I think it is something that goes to how energized young people are about the issues of racial justice, climate crisis, the need for everyone to get health care. There's a really engaged younger generation that we have not seen in recent political memory, and I don't think they're going away. I think they're in for keeps. They really care, and we saw it again yesterday. And I'm looking forward to partnering with them because they were a big part of my victory in the years ahead, especially on the climate crisis, on racial justice issues.
Senator, Marjorie's the cup half full kind of person. I'm the cup fully empty kind of person. Regardless of outcome, the predicted blue wave did not materialize. Democrats have fewer seats in the House. It's a long shot that you'll have a majority via tie in the Senate. We don't know what the ultimate outcome on the presidential side is. Do the results suggest that the Democrats as a party should be re-examining their message?
Well, I will just say this. I'm a Marjorie kind of a person. I would say it was a long shot that I would win this year. By the way, it was a long shot that Joe Biden would be our nominee and that Joe Biden would win. just a few short months ago. His political funeral had already been presided over by every single pundit in America. So from my perspective, I operate under the premise that you have to fight for everything that you believe in. That's the only way you put together winning coalitions. And so on the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, racial justice, I'm going to continue to advocate. Again, we're within a cusp right now of taking over the Senate. That's with 2 extra seats from Georgia. We'll see what happens there. We control the House of Representatives, and the Democrats are most likely to control the presidency. Mm-hmm. So, there's a time to reevaluate, but I would not think on a day like today that is something that's appropriate. The Democrats are actually winning right now, not quite to the level that the polling indicated that we would, but nonetheless, it is a victory for Democrats.
And yet at the same time, Senator Markey, we have a president of the United States who is still in the running here, who's fomented racism, who put kids in cages, who's ridiculed the disabled, who ridiculed veterans, who gave their lives for this country. And he got 70 million votes. So what does that say about our country?
Well, it continues to say that our country has been divided. Harry Truman, it was a nail biter in 48. Jack Kennedy, nail biter. Humphrey versus Nixon, 68, nail biter. Carter versus Ford, nail biter. Gore versus Bush, nail biter. Clinton versus Trump, nail biter. The country has been divided since 1948. It continues to be divided. That's why the Democrats have to work hard to make sure that we get out all of our votes, which is what we were really focusing upon today, which is why the 18 to 34 vote, I think, is going to turn out to be so critical in the advances which we have made.
But Senator Markey, wouldn't you say President Trump is a little bit different than those? This race is a little bit...
I don't deny that he's the most racist and criminally negligent president that we've seen, but he's just tapping in to an already existing a body of votes, pool of votes that have been there. And we saw it in 2016. We saw it again in 2020. In other words, he didn't, we thought that all of that had been dialed down. The racism, the appeal to xenophobia, anti-women rhetoric. But the truth is that when we lifted up the cover, we saw that it hadn't been dialed down at all. It was there the whole time. And what Trump did was put the activating fluid on it in 2016, and he did so again. And it just shows how fundamentally divided the country is.
Senator Markey, let's assume for argument's sake, I know you're hoping that the 2 Georgia Senate seats come through. Let's assume for argument's sake, Mitch McConnell continues to lead the Senate. And we know that a President Biden can do a lot by executive action. He can rejoin, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, which I know would mean a lot to you and a lot of people in this country. But he can't raise taxes. He can't eliminate tax breaks for the wealthy from Donald Trump to fund all of the ambitious programs he talked about. So if McConnell does maintain his leadership of the Senate, is this just 2 more years of gridlock in Washington?
Well, there is a big difference because Joe Biden will be president. He does know how to work across the aisle. He has a magical, legendary ability to do so. And that will be our challenge. We'll control the House. We can create an agenda over there. We're very close to a majority in the Senate. And under this hypothetical that McConnell still is the majority leader, we will be in a much stronger position with Joe Biden as president to try to find ways of crossing the aisle. That's Joe Biden's modus operandi. And by the way, I have 550 laws that have been signed by presidents, and I had to find a Republican each time. So I will be working towards that goal as well.
Can we talk shorter term, though, just for 2 seconds? Regardless of who controls the Senate, regardless of who ends up winning the presidency, should the American people expect to wait till at least February until there's an adequate relief package?
I hope not. My belief is that our first real opportunity to show the American people that their government can work for them is that the Democrats and Republicans come back in a lame duck session and put together a package to provide the health care and economic relief which families across this country so desperately need. We're heading into a winter spike, no matter what the president says about Tony Fauci, he's right. And I think that message post-election is something that gives us an opportunity to begin to work in a bipartisan fashion, because that's the only way ultimately that we can help every American family.
Senator Markey, we only have about 30 seconds left, but you're a senator obviously now, just sailed to re-election. You've been in Congress for all these years. Anything you'd like to add to your resume before you relax by the beach?
Well, you know, I always wanted to be a Major League Baseball commissioner, but I think being a United States Senator from Massachusetts is just the greatest honor that anyone can have. As you know, my father was a milkman, drove a truck for the Hood Milk Company, and his son is a United States Senator. And I take that very seriously. And so there really isn't any more that I could ask than this great honor that the people of Massachusetts have bestowed upon me.
Well, let me just say also, Senator, don't even dream of retiring until you finish this work you started on daylight saving time. That's a directive from one of your constituents.
I'll just finish on this. Yes, I was able to add the weekend for Halloween, so that daylight savings time would not start until then, and I moved daylight savings time to the beginning of March from the end of April. But I'm not done. This is something that you can do on a bipartisan basis, and I'm going to work in the next 2 years to extend it even further. I do believe that the one thing that makes the corners of everyone's mouth turn upwards is the extra daylight in the evening. And I'm going to try to get that done on a bipartisan basis.
Senator Markey, congratulations and good luck in the years ahead. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So Margery,
yes,
it was fun to have you here tonight. Did you have fun? Tell the truth.
I had lots of fun, Jim, always.
Raise your right hand and say that.
I had lots of fun. I love, radio, TV, it's fun, Jim.
Speaking of radio, I feel I have an obligation as your radio co-host every 30 minutes to ask you how you're coping. And at the top of the show, you answered. It's 30 minutes later. How you doing?
Well, Jim, all your listeners and viewers know that you know everything. So I would like you to tell me when we're going to know who the next president of the United States is. Could you weigh in? Is it going to be Trump or Biden? I can't take much more of this.
Do you believe what we heard on the radio today? That the counters from Nevada are going to be counting Saturday and Sunday. It's a little tiny state. What are they taking tomorrow off?
What's the rush, Jim? What's the rush? Go on for days. It's crazy.
Well, in any case, hopefully it'll come to an end pretty soon, hopefully peacefully. Yep. Margery, I'll see you tomorrow at 11 on my favorite radio show, Boston Public Radio.
I hope I make it.
Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's it for us, but we will, of course, continue to stay on top of all the election dramas that unfolds in the days and weeks to come on Greater Boston. And on Monday, one of the people who knows the president best, his niece, Mary Trump, will join me on what she expects from her uncle ahead. But now our special presentation of Election 2020 What's Next continues up until 9 o'clock on 89.7 radio and online at wgbhnews.org/election2020. Joe Matthews up next, followed a little later by Arun Roth. Thanks for watching and listening. And as always, please stay safe.
Thank you, Jim, and good evening as we continue a special night of conversation here at GBH Election 2020. What's next? I'm Joe Matthew from GBH's Morning Edition, and I'm joining you from Studio 6 at GBH News in Boston, where tonight we bring you something different. A conversation that transcends the chaos in the presidential race and national politics, driven by you, our listeners and viewers, and a collection of voices from our community that will make up a panel to help us understand this moment in history, how we got here, and yes, what's next. We are live tonight on 89.7 FM across GBH News social platforms, including Facebook Live, where we invite your comments, and on Zoom as well, where we're joined by a special audience that'll be contributing via text and video a little bit later on in the hour. So sit back, consider the questions you may want to ask our panelists this evening, and share this next hour with us as we live through one of the most important moments in our history.
This is a country with amazing opportunities. I've lived abroad. In my opinion, this is the best country. Let's put excuses aside and just focus on setting goals and pursuing those goals.
I'm hopeful for people to see that we're in a time that needs collective action
and collective solutions. And regardless of what happens over the next couple of days, we're all Americans and we all have to get together. And we can't be so polarized. This country is just not that way.
The priority for me is that we stop separating each other and we all work together as a whole. That's what this country's supposed to be. That's what we're supposed to do. And we need the freedom to do that.
Some of the voices we've heard since Election Day, the hopes, dreams, and fears of Americans, many of which we'll be discussing tonight as GBH News presents Election 2020. What's next? I'm Joe Matthew. It's been almost 48 hours since the polls closed, and the presidential race tonight is still undecided. Votes are still being counted. President Trump is suing to have the process stopped. And states including Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada have yet to be called tonight. Based on the states that have been called, though, by the Associated Press and by NPR, Joe Biden leads Donald Trump by 264 to 214 electoral votes at this moment. The race could be called in either direction at any time. That is the backdrop for our conversation tonight. Now, by now, you've probably attended some of these virtual events, maybe here at GBH. Just in case, though, if it is your first time, a couple of housekeeping items. Your microphones are muted. Your video is turned off, and we cannot take your comments in the chat box. We will, though, share relevant information with you there. We do want to hear from you, though, as I mentioned. Thanks to those of you who sent in questions early. We'll take a look at those and be bringing them up with our panelists through the evening. And we're going to ask you to join us on our virtual stage as well. Put the best question you have for one of our panelists in the Q&A box if you're with us tonight on Zoom, and you will find that at the bottom of your screen. Our producers will chat with you, and I hope that I see you here on the air before this evening is over. Now, that said, let's bring in our first guest, GBH News senior reporter Philip Martin. He spent last evening with hundreds of protesters who marched from Nubian Square to Copley Square to call for votes to be counted and for democracy to be protected. Philip joins us via Zoom. It's good to see you, sir. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Good to see you, Joe. Quite a volatile moment, isn't it?
Well, that's for sure. The last time we saw a picture of you on social media, you were wearing body armor and Kevlar on your way out to cover this event. A lot of people, Philip, feared violence would break out in cities like ours. We've already seen it a lot of times in the past couple of months around the country. We have not seen that, though, in the last couple of days. So what is happening on the streets?
Well, as I said, Joe, it's a lot of anger, and we've seen most protests that we've seen have been peaceful. But what happened last night was also peaceful. You had hundreds, perhaps about 500, 600 people who met in Nubian Square. This was a protest that was fueled by anger over what many see as a naked power grab by the president, beginning with this extraordinary statement of having won the election and then demanding that the counting of votes be halted, at least in states, where he's ahead or was at least. And Trump's legal team has filed numerous lawsuits to halt the voting. And like Trump supporters, Biden supporters last night are very angry. One of the speakers last night told the crowd,
Trump is trying to steal the election, and that is why there is nothing left to wait for. There is nothing left to see. Now is the time to go all out to shut the system down and drive Trump out.
And Joe, many Trump supporters are just as vociferous, of course. And Trump has called on them, and quite a few of them who are armed and they're wearing camouflage, has called on them to stop the vote count. And they're responded in places like my home city of Detroit, as well as in Maricopa County, Arizona, Phoenix, and Atlanta and elsewhere. And they're showing up and they're protesting.
We saw images and heard the sounds just now in Greater Boston with Jim Browdy. Stop the count was the chant in both of those locations. Philip Martin, you spend time speaking with supporters of both campaigns, members of both parties. What do President Trump supporters tell you when you talk about these issues?
Well, some, of course, are like the voters we've seen in Maricopa County out in mass and will do anything, like to support their candidate. Others are people like Al Montagna of Plymouth, who I met 4 years ago in 2016, the night of the election. It's a 71-year-old guy, father of 8, runs his own business. He's a Christian. He describes himself as Christian, very religious. He's conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interviewing people in a bar in Cleveland Circle, Joe. And Montagna, he could barely contain himself. This is 2016, the night of the election, but he could barely contain himself when the Electoral College results tipped toward Trump.
Yeah, I am surprised. The angry white man has spoken. The Democrats give everything away. They take it from the working people and they give it to the people that don't want to work.
And he voted for Trump again on Tuesday.
Was improving. The black people, the Asian people, the women, everybody was improving under Trump.
So has the angry white man spoken, or have things improved for everyone else? I'm confused.
The angry white man has spoken, and I think that's what this election is all about. When you hear people like Margery say she doesn't understand how 70 million people could vote for Donald Trump, well, a great deal of that is about white grievance. As you could hear in Al Montagna's comments, stereotypes of every sort, and a belief that the country is a better place because of Donald Trump. But one thing that's different about Montagna, Joe, that's different from many of his supporters, he said that if Biden wins, he will recognize him as his president. And so the question is, how many Trump supporters will come to regard Biden the same way if he prevails? If Trump prevails, it's clear that he will not have the support of more than half the country. That's very clear, especially after this naked campaign of voter suppression, verifiably, clear as day power grabs and manipulation of the federal government through his appointees like William Barr at the Department of Justice, and again, naked racism. There was a March 2019 poll from the Pew Research Center that found that 56% of Americans said Mr. Trump has done too little to distance himself from white nationalist groups that I've written about this week, in fact.
Philip Martin is with us on GBH's Election 2020. What's next? Before you leave us, Philip, as we look across the next couple of days, as I mentioned, this race could be called at any moment. It could take days or weeks for all we know, but that will be a decisive moment. Will you be back on the streets covering more protests? What's going to happen in the city of Boston that day?
Absolutely, Joe. You can imagine that whether Donald Trump prevails or Joe Biden prevails, there will be demonstrations. The street is talking a lot louder than many members of Congress, for example, these days. We just heard from Senator Markey, but louder than Senator Markey and louder than a lot of politicians right now is the street. And right now, again, the street is largely peaceful, but there are people out here with guns. Not so much Massachusetts. We don't see it here. Our laws are very, very different. But where you're allowed to openly carry guns in a place like Arizona, that's a different story altogether. And you're likely to see demonstrations. Hopefully, they will remain peaceful. Hopefully, people they can scream, they can shout, they can do anything they want. I will be out there, Joe, covering these demonstrations in Massachusetts. It's likely we'll also be in New Hampshire and some of the surrounding states.
The thing you may or may not know about Philip Martin is that he would be there whether or not he was being paid to cover it. That's why he's GBH's senior reporter. And Philip, I want to thank you for helping us start this off tonight the way we should.
Thank you, Joe.
And thanks for all the work you're doing and helping us write the first draft of history here at GBH. Coming up, we widen this conversation to include some of the brightest minds in Boston, and that includes you. This is GBH News.
I'm most nervous for, honestly, everyone's mental health. No matter which way this goes, I don't think that people are behaving safely, especially during a pandemic. I'm most nervous about how people are going to react either way. So we'll just have to see.
Election 2020, what's next? Continues from GBH News. I'm Joe Matthew, and thank you for joining us this evening as we welcome our panel I've been looking forward to this moment. It's something you don't see or hear very often in local media. As we say good evening to our three panelists, and in a moment to you. Malia Lizu is a lecturer at MIT's Sloan School of Management who came up as a community organizer, founded Mass Vote when she was all of 19, and went on to become an entrepreneur and specialist in urban development. She focused on communities of color while an executive at Berkshire Bank. And now she helps people like us understand what's going on in the world. Malia will be with us in just a moment, along with Greg Fried, political philosopher at Boston College, who examines the challenges to liberal democracy, the rise of ethno-nationalism. What a perfect time to be with Greg. And Dipayan Ghosh, director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at Harvard's Shorenstein Center. Dipayan worked as a tech advisor with the Obama administration and has a deep understanding of the role that technology and social media have been playing in this whole contest. And so we say good evening to all of you. Thank you for the three of us, the three of you, for being with us this evening. Malia, I'd like to start with you as we consider this moment around us here. Regardless of the outcome in this election, there's obviously a lot of work to do, no matter who wins. Tell us how to avoid the fatigue that may set in post-election as we try to keep our eyes on progress.
Thanks so much, and it's great to be with you and all of you here on Zoom. I think, excuse me, I think what we want to recognize is that we are fatigued and figure out how we can rely on one another, how we can lean on community, because what's necessary is for us to reweave the fabric of the American society. And regardless of who wins, I think we want to think of King and his ultimate goal of reconciliation. And that means that we're going to have to figure out how to be tired, but also how to continue to lean in towards justice.
Greg Fried, indeed, we could use a political philosopher right about now. Welcome. Thanks for being with us, Greg. You told us that we need to go back to our roots. I think I know what you meant by that. Our founding documents, you think of the phrase, we the people. What did you mean by that?
Well, thank you for having me, Joe, and I'm so pleased to be here with the other panelists. That's right. The first words of our Constitution are we the people. But there's been an inherent contradiction in the American Republic from its founding, if not from before, which is a contradiction between our stated ideals, most especially that all men or all people are created equal, and the historical reality of slavery and racism that have shadowed those ideals throughout our history, and that we have been confronting ever since, and we have confronted in this electoral cycle. So the question facing us is how we can reinvigorate that sense of we the people despite being exhausted. And the most promising sign I see is the voter turnout in this election, and especially, as some of your other guests have said before, the enormous increase in the vote by young people in this country.
Dipayan Ghosh, it's been said by Donald Trump himself that he could not have won the presidency without Twitter, without social media. When you were advising the Obama White House on this stuff, this was another world. You just go back 10 years, the role that Twitter, that social media played in all of this was a very different factor. Now it's a real driver, Dipayan. Just today, Twitter has been labeling tweets from the President of the United States as misinformation. We wouldn't be here now, it seems to me, without the echo chamber that is social media.
Seriously, you said it. And Joe, I think what we've seen is just a fundamental transformation in the technological base underlying society. We've seen media move online, and a lot of the things that we used to feel as though are within the kind of window that we can say and do in the public over media, and in our towns and our cities in public, we can do very different kinds of things online, and we don't have to take accountability for them. And I think that's really what we're seeing in the case of certain conversations that are happening on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the kinds of difficult situations that you and Philip were just speaking about seem to have actually coalesced originally on social media in large extent, and Facebook has, as a matter of fact, taken down a few groups today, I think, related to the elections. So it's just a different kind of technological set of circumstances that we're living in.
That's for sure, with a very powerful impact on politics. Malia, you told me we need to build new models when we were talking if we're going to bring the people of our country back together. I don't know if those models include Twitter and Facebook, but can you expand more on that?
Yes, and I think they do include social media. I mean, it's an important part of how we communicate and how we see one another. I think the new models come in us understanding the history of how we got here and us recognizing each other's experiences. And so what we've done a lot is trainings and, we're going to understand the problem, but we really just have to act differently in order to find the solution. And so I think it can happen anywhere. I mean, if you want to start loving people on Twitter, start loving people on Twitter. If you want to make sure your employees feel that they belong and that they have a space to talk about how they may be feeling, help them do that. But we get new models from trying and from being also willing to maybe not get it right the first time. And what we need right now is a whole lot of trying.
I want to bring in some questions from our audience this evening, if we could. And Greg, this I think would work for you. This is from Lashika, who says, how can Trump say we should count the vote and then say we should not count? Is he trying to put our country's sovereignty in danger? Or is our country's democracy in danger? Is it that severe, Greg?
I think it is that severe when you have the President of the United States asking for voting to be not counted. That is a very serious step for anyone in government, let alone for the President of the United States. And it casts a real pall on what is happening in this election. However, he doesn't get to decide who votes and who doesn't vote. And perhaps part of the healing process will be to see that there is a limit on the kind of disruption that Trump can bring. And so I am looking forward to this having a peaceful and lawful resolution.
I'm sure that you can relate with that, Depayan. The fact of the matter is, uncertainty, though, can be a very dangerous scenario, whether you're talking about the financial markets or the way people behave themselves. Sometimes, as you point out, when others aren't looking on social media, it's kind of the digital version of road rage, when people can't see you, the way you behave.
Yeah, and people don't have to necessarily be accountable for what they say online, especially on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Some of them try to enforce a real identity policy, Facebook being one, but it's really hard, as you know. Facebook is also known to have taken down millions and millions of accounts pushing misinformation and disinformation during this election cycle. And who knows? I mean, many of that might have gotten through. We're seeing a lot of misinformation, not just in the English language, but also Spanish language in the context of this election just over the past few days.
Malia, Aaron is asking from our Zoom audience, how can there be a coming together when the divide is so great? And now we're really getting to something here. There isn't just a difference of opinion, he says. It's like one side says the sky is blue, the other one the sky is red. How do you start with that large of a divide?
This is where it's big, but I don't want us to get discouraged. And it's big because it gets to individual relationships, right? You know people who you may have very different views about things that you don't feel so passionately about. And that becomes easy. But the question is we're going to live as 300 million plus people. Where can we create space? So it's not that everyone has to be your best friend. It's not that you have to invite everyone to your house, but it's that in the commons, in the collective, we have a way to treat people that makes everyone feel safe. And, we talked about the misinformation on social media. I think one of the things that has really gotten me is the Zoom bombing and the terror that is, being put on people trying to do conferences online. These people wouldn't come, right, to an event to just yell at people and yell the N-word and things like that, but they will do it on Zoom. And when we lose that floor, when we lose some type of when we lose recognizing our own humanity, I think it's very hard to get across that divide. And that's where we're starting, quite frankly, Joe. We're starting at needing to recognize each other's humanity.
I'd love for all of you to weigh in on this, because this does seem to be the question of our time. Whether it's President Trump, whether it's President Biden, whether it's a D or an R in the Senate or in control of the House, there's going to have to be a next chapter here where people actually look at each other and talk like human beings, Greg.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's fascinating what Malia and DePine are saying about social media. The philosopher Hannah Arendt said that the most important thing about human beings as political animals is that we appear to one another as embodied, that we're there for each other and can be accountable to one another when we are engaging in the political sphere. The anonymity brings out the worst in us. And so I think what's really important is that we all find ways to meet people who do not agree with us and have conversations and not feel like we have to react to everything we disagree with. It's very important to listen to why people are angry without getting angry oneself, and to try to find the roots and the pathways to meet up and restart the common conversation of we the people.
That brings us to the cancel culture, DePine. There's a criteria. There are boxes to check. And if you can't check those boxes, you can't talk to me. That's the way it goes in this country right now.
Seriously, you said it, and I think we are in a really divided state right now, and whatever we might try to say, whatever we might, the four of us might try to suggest people do, during this discussion, we know the reality too, that at least right now we are in a divided nation. The level of kind of tension between the two parties and the political bases of those two parties is extraordinarily high. We are going to see it play out in the media, potentially even in the real world in the coming days. And I think it will be very important, whoever wins this election, whoever is determined to have won this election, to really message that we need to bring the country together. To Greg's point, we need to find ways to really bridge this divide, and I think it is possible.
If you're just joining us here on the radio on 89.7 or on our digital platforms here at GBH News, welcome to a special presentation this evening, Election 2020, What's Next? I'm Joe Matthew from Morning Edition, and I want to invite you right now to raise your hand and join us here on Zoom. If you're part of our virtual audience, we'd love for you to join us by video and ask a question of our panelists so we can make this a true town hall style event. We want to hear from as many different voices as we can, and I want to ask you a question, all three of you, from Omar, because now it gets to be a little bit personal here. Omar says, I believe the media perpetuates the political polarization, and it's certainly not the first time I've heard that, and I know there's truth to that. He says, what about the role of the media market in polarization and silos of the media? Fox, MSNBC, CNN, OAN, everyone's got their own audience. Malia, how can we expect our political climate to get better? And what role should news media be playing in this?
Well, I think that news media needs to continue to tell the news, and maybe the 24-hour news cycle and always needing to, to have some type of breaking news leads us to chasing things that don't serve our narrative right now.
Yeah.
But I also think that it has to be okay that we disagree politically. And when I talk about reweaving fabric, I'm not talking about someone agreeing with all of my views, but I am talking about that someone who looks like me shouldn't get shot in their bed while sleeping, right? Like, there's things we can do to reweave the fabric by making people's bodies and lives matter, and making, children should not be torn from their parents. And so having policies that tend to inflame, right, and reinforce this, I think, is really what we need to look at. So that, yes, the media plays a role in our narrative, but we have other countries that have very partisan media, right? I mean, England has partisan media, and they've had it for years, right? So I'm not sure if media is to blame as much as maybe this marketing culture we have and this need to always have breaking news. But what really is to blame is the 400 plus years of institutional and structural bias and racism.
In news media specifically.
Oh, no, I was just talking about in life. I was kind of
in
getting
American culture. Fine.
I was saying, like, I think news media has a role, but the real tensions, right? Why we're mad at each other isn't necessarily because of the news media. It's because of that 8-minute and 46-second video, right? Like, and I think those are the things that are important for us to remember, that the calls are coming from inside the house.
Yeah. Greg, we call everything media. So anyone with a microphone, a camera, a podcast, everybody's got a show now. And that's why I am trying to be specific about news media when we talk about what the president likes to call the lame stream media, people who are actually, fly the trade of journalism through the airwaves or in print or online. What role are we playing in making this a problem, Greg, and how do we help make it better?
Well, I agree with Malia that the media isn't the deep problem, but it certainly can exacerbate the problem. But the media is parasitic on the divisions that exist already in our society, and the 24-hour news cycle, as well as the niche markets for talk radio and Fox News or whatever other ideologically oriented news organizations are, those then need that fuel to support the audience that they cultivate. But the deeper problem is ultimately the divisions that are there, and that's a 400-year-old problem. And so I do think that politics, and if Joe Biden is our next president, Biden can help us with addressing those problems. It's not something that we'll fix probably in my lifetime, but we can begin working on it in a way that creates new narratives, both for Americans and for the media, so that we can stop the kinds of destructive conversations that we're having now.
I want to ask you about, your specialty here with that regard, Depayan, because the internet and social media bring in new elements here when we start talking about the news media. It's been expanded and splintered many ways. For instance, since the race that elected your former boss, Barack Obama.
It has been splintered, and I think Malia and Greg are absolutely right, that there are social and political and historical contexts that need to be brought into this. I think I would add one more, which is that there is an economic context here. America is an open capitalistic system. It has been since the country's birth. And I think we often see media, based on whatever technologies the industry has at hand, fill in various markets because we don't necessarily have enough regulation in place. We mentioned England. We could also mention Germany and France. and other jurisdictions as well, which have a slightly different sort of brand of media regulation, where certain things are protected. And I think we might need to start considering that, at least in the context of social media and the internet.
Well, particularly as we go through this process of scrutiny in Washington, where Twitter, Facebook, Google are being called to testify on a regular basis. Republican lawmakers are threatening to break them up. We've got a question from one of our audience members. It's a real pleasure to be able to bring in Judy, who is with us with a question. Hi, Judy. Do us a favor and unmute yourself so we can hear you, by the way, and fire away when ready. Well, I guess we're having a little trouble hearing Judy this evening. There we go.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
I sure can, Judy. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for doing this. And my question is, I hear so many of my friends, they're despairing. They're like, you know, what, Biden's going to win, but he doesn't have the Senate. And so there's been a lot of activism that I've seen going into this, but what is the activism going forward, regardless of who is the winner? What can we do to make it better? Because we're going to have a lot of work to do no matter which person wins.
Malia, you want to take a stab at that? Thank you, Judy, for your question.
Absolutely. And thank you, Judy. You know, I think it looks a lot like what we've been doing, right? Movements last a long time, and then they're able to leap forward in moments like this. And so what I hope is that we don't hang up our movement jacket once Biden gets elected, and that we remain dedicated to the causes, that we're still willing to go out into the streets and make sure that policy can actually happen, that protects people, and that helps this conversation at least get to some type of resolution. So keep doing your activism, whatever it is, but also maybe live your life differently. Like, think about buying all of your holiday gifts, if you have the ability to buy holiday gifts, from minority businesses. Get creative and innovative about how maybe you can expose yourself to the communities that we're trying to include.
I'm struck, Malia, by the way you have gone back to, and Greg, you have also mentioned, and DePine, you probably have your own way of expressing this, but it's very personal. You're not talking about what people should be thinking in terms of vast issues affecting our nation. You're talking about what you can do today in your house or on your street or in your neighborhood.
The nation is an outcome of 50 states. And the states are outcomes of neighborhoods, right? And neighborhoods are outcomes of blocks. And after 22 years of doing this work in all kinds of places, what I realized is that open hearts are what build the strongest ties in communities. And this work is personal. It's not transactional. Yeah. It's transformational. And if I can be so bold to quote Dr. King, he has this great quote that says, "Of our technological genius, we've made of the world a brotherhood, but of our moral and spiritual genius, we have failed." Or, "We made the world a neighborhood, but of our moral and spiritual genius, we failed to make it a brotherhood." And I think in 1953, he was talking about the plane. Today, we're talking about Twitter, and we still have not been able to build a brother and sisterhood. And that's personal work.
I told you Malia founded Mass Vote when she was 19 here in Boston. Now you're starting to get a sense why. Christina has a question for us from our Zoom audience. Hi, Christina. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me on. And Greg, hi, it's nice to see you. I miss you here at Suffolk. So listen, my question really is about actionable next steps. We are in an era of tribalism. It's clear. And we're all recognizing how destructive it is and talking about how we need to end it. But what are the actionable items that we need to do in the short, medium, and long term? Like, what are the tools in the toolkit to do this? I could name off the top of my head a bunch of things, civic education and onward. But I'd like to hear from all of the panelists, like, what it is that we should be doing, not so much as individuals to recognize these things, but what are the public policy steps we need to take?
Christina, thanks for your question. Greg, do you want to start us off?
It's so wonderful to hear from my former colleague, Christina at Suffolk University. I do think that, to go back to Judy's question about this sense of despair, and I don't think we should underestimate how terrible it is for most Americans to be living through COVID and the isolation it causes. That just augments our sense of despair. But on the policy level, I think what people need to think about is, what do we want to see if we are so fortunate as to have a President Biden? What are the most important policies that he could work on that would have a possible chance of success? And I think there's some indications. First of all, we know that across the aisle, there was work done under the Trump presidency on minimizing mass incarceration. And I think that that's work that can go forward and would have enormous benefits for our society. And we can talk at length about why that would be so.
Yeah.
I also think that if we have a relief bill, which I think the Republicans are going to have to do, because otherwise the economy is going to crash once the pandemic revs up in this third wave.
Don't you think that happens magically? Now, once this race is called, Greg, somehow that's going to get done by the end of the year?
I think so, and I hope so, because I would like to see a President Biden attach an infrastructure bill to that. Because that's the way that we can unite working class Americans across the country in working on the infrastructure that belongs to all of us as we the people.
So Greg has given us some very specific answers there, which is really helpful to Payan. Do you like where he's going with that? It was infrastructure week every 2 weeks for the last 4 years, but we never saw too many jobs happen. We've been seeing a realignment on Wall Street, even with investors starting to get the idea that a Biden presidency is likely, and that type of economic stimulus will follow.
Indeed. I do like where Greg is going with that. I'll try to say something additional to it instead of harp on. I think what connects the issues that Greg is talking about, and where are other areas that we should be thinking about according to that theme? Well, I think the theme is about inclusiveness, equity, levelizing the economic situation across the country. And that really has to do with figuring out a way through public policy to recognize that there are people that are well off, and there are many pockets of the population of the United States that are disadvantaged. And that disadvantage is not going to go away just through reforms over the next few years that perhaps the Biden administration puts forward. It's through a recognition fundamentally that there is this unfairness and that we need to do something about it. We've kind of commercialized an infrastructure that supports the bias that's happening, whether it's in the media or in education or in financial access to finance. Those are all areas, healthcare. Those are all areas that we need to try to start to address.
I see you nodding, Malia. I'd love to hear from you before we move on. How do you bring all of this home locally?
Vote, get out on the streets. No, what I do want to point out is that it has to be more than one thing, right? So we can't look I think we are looking at politics to be the answer to our woes and policy to be the answer to our woes, because then we're doing something. And, I often think of a quote so often in my work, which is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. We can come up with all the policies, we can come up with all the trainings and the procedures, but if our culture is one that's based, in white privilege, these policies are never going to get passed or actualized in earnest. And so I think we do need to think about how we take action, but we also as a country might need to step back and see how we have to retell our story so that we can get to these policy outcomes.
Great answer and great insights from all of you. Malia Lazu, a lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Management, Greg Freed, From Boston College, our political philosopher this evening, and Dipayan Ghosh, Director of Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at Harvard's Shorenstein Center. I feel lucky to have spent some time with you, and I want to thank you guys for everything that you brought to the table tonight.
Thank you so much.
Here on Election 2020, what's next? We're going to have a lot more straight ahead. What have we learned over the last half hour or so from these bright minds? John Keller, at large, will join us next here on 89.7 WGBH, WGBH HD1 Boston, online at WGBHnews.org, Boston's local NPR.
I'm nervous that the Supreme Court will become more right-wing. I'm nervous that our economy is going to tank.
A lot of the dialogue seems like it's going in the direction that isn't consistent with our forefathers and what they wanted this country to be.
I'm definitely concerned with race, first and foremost, definitely concerned with LGBTQ rights.
The list goes on and on of things I'm concerned about. I just think that the world is watching us right now and chuckling to themselves.
Maybe you heard some of your own thoughts there, represented by some of the listeners we've been speaking with and some of the folks who've been out and about this election week. I'm Joe Matthew. Welcome, if you're just joining us, to a special presentation of GBH News, Election 2020. What's next? We've shared a lot of ideas this evening, heard from a lot of you, and I thank all of you who brought questions to our panel. And we now turn to a friend who helps us understand times like these, and that would be John Keller, political analyst and columnist for WBZ and CBSN, and a regular contributor here at GBH News. He's with us frequently on Morning Edition. We've been talking a lot about this cycle. Good evening, John. Thanks for being part of the broadcast. Make sure you unmute, by the way, since we're all here living in the rules of Zoom, which I see you using on a regular basis, interviewing newsmakers.
How's that
it going? Better? Yeah, you look good. You sound good. That was quite a conversation. I wasn't sure what some of the answers were going to be with some pretty difficult questions from our listeners, asking about the responsibility, the role that maybe the news media has played in some of this. And John, how to cross the divide once this race is called?
Well, for my money, Joe, one of the most interesting comments since election night was made in a letter to the membership of the Archdiocese of Boston by Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who said in part the challenge is always to transform a crowd into a community. I thought that was a very apt way of putting it. Donald Trump has proven to be a master at drawing and exciting a crowd, but not so adept at creating a sense of community beyond his own narrow base. That's why he appears to be headed for defeat. He created a sense of community. If you ever covered a Trump rally, and I'd love to hear Philip Martin's comments on that, because I know he's been to a few of those.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sense of community he created was, look, we all have red hats on. We all share some common grievances. We all hate the mainstream media. But that's not the kind of community that your panel was just talking about. Where does that really get us? It gets us worked up into a state of maximum bile, and it gets us a hopelessly divided and gridlocked country where important things don't get done. We can't even unify over how to protect ourselves against a deadly infectious virus. So the challenge for Joe Biden, if in fact he's the next president, and for the entire Congress, is going to be to figure out how to transform a crowd into some semblance of a community. And Joe, I think Biden has a tremendous opportunity to do that, in part because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to incite a crowd into a mob, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we saw the president trying to do that earlier tonight. That was a sorry sight.
Mm-hmm.
Look, Professor Freed in your conversation cited as a positive development of this election the turnout of the youth vote. And this pains me as a card-carrying baby boomer to say, but it's long since time for younger generations to step up and take control of our political culture. I mean, the baby boomers are great music, great food. You can get sushi anywhere now. When I was a kid, Joyce Chen's was the only place around to get Asian food outside of Chinatown. But when you look around here in Boston, you see the younger generations starting to step up and take control. Like I say, I grew up here, and to see our African-American DA of Suffolk County openly and bravely verbalizing the need for decriminalizing certain kinds of offenses, focusing more on restitution and rehabilitation than incarceration, things that her predecessors talked about but were afraid to say up front. When I see Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley speaking, being very outspoken about the urgent needs of her community and trying to push her older colleagues to really start addressing them. And, when you see a Boston mayoral race taking shape for next year, already we've got a woman of color and an Asian American woman as serious challengers to an Irish Catholic incumbent who himself has undergone an incredible transformation throughout his life, from a conservative, sort of part of a hidebound old Boston culture to someone who moves freely and interacts comfortably with communities of color throughout this diversity. It gives you hope that as the generational torch gets passed, we start to see real political progress.
That's the real change, right? Every generation that turns over. But John, you're also describing life here in blue Massachusetts, right? Isn't that the way it's supposed to be? I know people knock on Boston a lot, and this city has a horrible history of race relations and outright racism. But the scenario you're describing is not being duplicated all over the country.
No, it isn't. And, I don't want to sound like the typical Massachusetts snob who says, well, if only the lower 49 could be more like us.
Right.
But give us our props here. I mean, I think we're, in our own halting way, showing a way forward. I mentioned that Joe Biden has a big opportunity here. And let's be honest about it. As much as we might love to speculate about policies that promote tolerance and bringing us all together, and those are all laudable goals, in America today, particularly at a time of economic distress, money talks and everything else walks. Joe Biden, if he becomes president, is going to be presiding over a massive federal stimulus, maybe more than one, to help pull us out of where we are. It's going to be done in collaboration with Republicans in Congress and with Mitch McConnell. And all that dough is an opportunity to seed real change, to elevate, for instance, communities of color that have borne the brunt of the pandemic. And he's got political cover to do it. But he's got to do it artfully. He's got to do it in the most bipartisan way he can. Is he up to it? I think he is. We're about to find out, Joe.
Last question for John Keller at large. You've covered a lot of races. You and I have covered a couple of them together now. We've done conventions. We've done rallies. But this one's different. Even after what happened in 2000, I'm just wondering what your expectations are and how you're preparing to cover the moment when this race is called. What's going to happen?
It might be later tonight. I've been keeping an eye
right
on the
now.
results. Yeah.
Is that anticlimactic because of the legal challenges, or is that the moment, John?
I think that's the moment. Look, there's going to be a lot of storminess, legal challenges, protests, you name it. However, when you see a far-right conservative like Rick Santorum, who's now a commentator on CNN, coming on after the president's remarks and just straight up denouncing them, I think that gives you a sense that even on the right, a lot of people are ready to move on. I think of Philip Martin's quote from the guy he interviewed in the bar, the Trump voter, earlier tonight, who suggested, well, Biden's going to, if he wins, he'll be my president. And just a little quick bit of context here, Joe. I know I don't look old enough to remember this, but I was old enough to remember 1968. Bitter election, bitterly divided country over the war and race, a year of assassinations, of riots in the streets that make the trouble we had this summer look like child's play.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to put it in context. We've made it through much worse. The arc of history has continued to bend toward justice. I think people really should have hope that that will continue.
You're here, John Keller. Thanks for being part of our broadcast tonight. It's great to see you. It's great to hear from you as always. And when this race is called, I'm calling you.
Thank you, Joe.
Election 2020, what's next? John brought us a dose of hope. We're going to go all in on that next with Boston's poet laureate here on GBH News.
Hi there. Good evening, folks. My name is Portia Olayiwola, and I'm thrilled to be gathering with you all under these circumstances and thinking and paving a way into our future within these next coming days. I'm going to read a poem, and I'm thinking about both in the context of women, but specifically Black women. And I think this is the anniversary or 100-year anniversary of, women's right to vote. So have been thinking and talking about that.
Hey, Portia, it's great to have you with us tonight. I'm delighted that you're here. It's Joe. And I want to tell everybody that Portia Olayiwola is Boston's poet laureate, and she works with young artists as the artistic director as well at Mass Leap, a literary nonprofit you should know about. And I want to tell you, I've learned something every time I have heard Portia speak. She's going to read a little poetry for us tonight. But Portia, I'd just love to hear first how you're doing. The last time I talked to you was at the beginning of the pandemic. It was a very scary moment when we were going into the summer. And boy, a lot has happened since then. When you add the results of this election, just a great deal of chaos around the country. How are you doing? Make sure you unmute yourself too so we can hear you.
Hi there. It's good to see you again, on the other side of the screen, so to speak.
Yes.
I'm okay. Super busy, super occupied, and consumed like most of us. But, alive and in the moment right now.
Are you feeling hope? Are you feeling optimism? Are you feeling depressed?
I think that I am definitely hopeful, but I am by nature and by intellect a pessimist, and from experience a pessimist, but I am hopeful. I'm just not optimistic, as Cornel West says.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. You're going to read something for us. And before you do, I would just love to know what went into your choosing this piece. You can go in so many directions when somebody like me says, hey, read us a beautiful piece of poetry. But you always seem to land it in the middle of something profound. And I wonder what process you went through in picking it.
Yeah, I had been deciding, originally I wanted to write something new, but time got the best of me. But I had been deciding between a poem about the city and holding the city in heart and hard work. And also this poem just about the anniversary of the suffrage movement and the context of Black politics and the context of the current politics and the current political climate. So I had, chosen a poem based off that.
Great. It's pretty tough to get through these readings with Portia with a dry eye, I'll warn you. I'm going to give you the floor now, Portia Olayiwola. Thanks for being with us here on GBH.
Thank you. This poem first appeared as a part of an exhibit with the Museum of Fine Arts. And it is called, What is the Suffrage Movement to a Black Woman? An anthem. Ain't nothing like power. Ain't a gift greater than mourning a failed defeat. Remind me again who I am. My mother's holy work, a girl the city spat out, veins spilled with blood and a ground unstained. If we allow the land to rule the land, do we ever cease to live? If we grant dominion to the body, each act is a grace unearthed. Remind me again who I am. Flight bird, dark shining, cleaved petal, bursting river, fable unlearned. There is a story where a president grows teeth for hands. There is a tale of a man who marches over his wife and still reaches the mountain peak. Give me the pen, and Eve devours all the apples. Pass me the torch, and the laws burn to the ground. Hand me the brush, and I reimagine the gavel, the switch. I unsign the declaration. I carve out the beast, morph into the lion answering the call. Show me an avenue, not built on my back, rocking chair and shotgun. Guardian God be Ida, and my skin Nina Simone. I sing strange blues. I unsound the percussion of my bones, and your mouth remind me again who I am. Woman child, breaths blossom, black dirt and hot sun, the nap curled swooping up at the edge of day, the wood handle on the last obedient knife. Remind me again. Announce the title loud. Say my name, and I bring down the wall. Call me out, and I blow the ceiling cover. I wipe the worry, wash history with tongue, and we grin through the shout, and we dance all the graves away, and we live, and we live, and we live. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that for us. Thank you for delivering that for us. And thank you for as always, picking the right thing. Portia Olayiwola is Boston's poet laureate, and we couldn't have done this without you. Portia, thanks for your patience and standing by and for being with us here. My name is Joe Matthew. This is Election 2020. What's next? I told you that would get you. Arun is here, huh? GBH's Arun Roth, who has a special edition of In It Together, which airs this evening on GBH and has been a safe space for people to talk about the challenges of living through this pandemic now for months. What's next? Well, the answer is Arun. How you doing?
Hey, okay. Arun Roth, the broadcast professional who had to remember to turn his mute button off.
That's going around. So this is the home studio, huh? I've never actually seen it like this.
Yeah,
God, look at you.
This is the basement in Lexington, which you'll have to close the door if the dog or the bird or the children or other things.
If you're with us on Zoom or social media, you're getting a great peek behind the scenes here. Arun, first of all, congratulations on In It Together. This has been one of the great experiments in local media, and it's been a massive success, and a lot of people rely on it. And well, we're going to get a taste of that coming up here. What's it been like for you to have this conversation every night?
It's been incredible, Joe. I mean, I think that you have experienced this. We get this in our work at times, at the best of times, where we're covering the news and it's almost like therapy, because if we weren't journalists, we'd be going crazy over this stuff, and it gives us a way to talk about it and process it by doing our jobs. And In It Together is like that, just all of the time. It's been, you know, I'm in the show much more personally than I am as a typical journalist. And just getting to talk to everybody. I mean, again, we're all going through these mad, ugly, horrendous times. And to be able to talk to the best experts, the best people locally about how we can keep our heads together getting through this is to be able to do that every evening. I mean, it's intense, it's work, but it's also an incredible luxury, an incredible way to connect with people sitting here in my basement.
Well, it's going around. Some people are running for president from their basements, as I keep hearing. Arun, what do you have in store for us tonight?
Oh, well, we're going to be taking on, as we have on the show from the beginning, looking at the ways that the pandemic has disproportionately affected certain communities of color in particular, but also, as we've been doing from the beginning, talking about the ways we can keep our heads together and, do the right kind of self-care that we need to.
That's great.
Those are things that, again, like you and I are journalists, we're going through everything, same things everybody else is. So it's easier to have those conversations, right?
Well, we're all, yes, but I'm going to be listening. I'm just like everybody else. We're all learning together here, and I have a feeling we'll all get a lot out of this. It's good to see you. You and I have been together in person, and well, since the pandemic, I guess. And Arun, it's a pleasure here. Why don't you bring us home tonight on Election 2020? What's next? Thanks for being with us, all of our panelists in this past hour. And on behalf of Jim Browdy and Margery EAGAN, here's Arun Roth.
From 89.7 GBH, this is a special edition of In It Together. I'm Arun Roth.
Okay.
Welcome back to the place where we can take off our masks and talk about how we're getting through this together. I just want to make sure I'm here. Is everybody hearing me? Okay, excellent. Wasn't hearing. We usually have our theme music. You can all imagine that in your heads. Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back to the place where we take off our masks and talk about how we're getting through this together. That's a phrase I've been saying in various ways for the last several months, and it's kind of wonderful at this particular moment to. You can actually see me with my mask off. I can see some of you, at least my guests. I can see in person, which is it's quite wonderful. But there's also a heavier thought this evening as we're doing this special edition of In It Together, and that's something that's been really at the back of all of this for the last several months, and certainly since the horrendous slow motion murder of George Floyd that the entire country was witness to, and the horrendous acts of violence against Black Americans, which led to the protests this summer and a really ugly continuing presidential campaign, which we're talking about right now as it's wrapping up, as we're still counting the votes. And to do a show that's called In It Together as our country is so deeply divided has been something that, it's we've been thinking about, the irony of that. But this show is a place where we have been talking about things together. There are times when things get political because unfortunately the pandemic has become a political thing. But tonight is a time where, as we're counting the votes, picking up the pieces, we can figure out, as we're asking tonight, what's next. So what is next for us right now? First, we're going to talk about what's next for the pandemic, locally and nationally, regardless of who ends up winning. First, we're going to hear about ways in which, as we've been talking about on the show from the beginning, that the pandemic has hit disproportionately communities of color, communities most at risk. And we're going to end the show with a check-in with yourself. We are living in a tremendously anxious time, and a lot of what we talked about over the last several months is self-care, how we get through this, keeping our heads together, keeping our families and our sense of who we are as we get through this. So let's jump right into it. Joining me first is Dr. Harold Koh. He's the professor of the practice of public health leadership at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Koh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Arun.
So first, let's talk about where we are picking up from this election. President Trump's pandemic response, we don't necessarily need to talk an awful lot about it because we've seen what it is over the last several months. But leaving regulation largely up to the states, there's a heavy investment in vaccine development, which is important to note, and federal aid packages. But looking ahead, if Joe Biden does go on to become the president, in terms of what you know about the Biden plan, what would we expect to see in terms of what's different in terms of the federal response?
Well, Arun, I think the response in the future under a President Biden would be dramatically different than what we've seen with the current administration. First of all, as you have alluded, we have yet to have a national plan or a united response for the United States to date. We've had 50 states going in 50 different directions. We've had states competing against each other for supplies and test kits. And we've had lots of mixed messages from the national leaders, which has sowed so much confusion. So I think that under President Biden, we would have a leader who would tackle this head on, empower his top public health agencies and his top public health scientists, stress the need for a united national effort going forward, have a strategy for testing and contact tracing and making sure that we don't run out of PPE through this flu season and beyond. And then I think we would have a president who, most important of all, would rely on the science and lead by example. So we've seen how the vice president has always been in public with a mask and has campaigned in a socially distanced way. And when the president acts and speaks, so many follow and watch what the advice might be. So I think under President Biden, we would see all those themes coming forward in a very powerful way.
You know, what we saw and talked about on the show, what we saw and talked about on the show over the last several months, well, especially in the early months, there was a lot of talk about the personal protective equipment and a lot of frontline workers, both healthcare workers, but other people who desperately needed that equipment not having what they needed. We've over time adapted in Massachusetts. In terms of what we would see with a more unified federal response, would we be likely to get more backup with things like that? And how would that affect us in a material way?
So, Arun, I was the former state commissioner here in Massachusetts under multiple Republican governors, and then also had the honor of being the Assistant Secretary for Health under a Democratic president, President Obama. So it's absolutely critical to have, in a time of crisis like this, a one government approach, federal, state, and local leaders all working together. And that unified theme is absolutely critical when we have seasonal flu already here. Even without COVID, that is a major public health challenge year in and year out. And we can overwhelm hospitalizations with a bad flu season alone. So that's why maximizing coordination, making sure that our PPE is at the right level and we don't run out. Vice President Biden has said that he would try to leverage more of the Defense Production Act to make sure that our heroic frontline workers in healthcare settings are getting the supplies they need and deserve. And so all those unified themes are really important as we go forward and hopefully have a COVID vaccine sooner rather than later.
And whoever ends up being president, in terms of what most desperately needs to be done in the next, looking at the next 3 to 6 months, the pandemic is unrelenting. We're seeing cases go back up again. All the experts are telling us that this is looking like it's going to be a difficult winter. How do we come out of that winter in a better position?
Well, Arun, from our experience, both in the United States and worldwide, we know that prevention and public health works to contain this virus. It's not easy, and this is a very tenacious and tough infectious disease threat. But we have seen around the world examples of countries who have done this in a unified way and brought infections down. Look, for example, in Australia, where they've pretty much reopened the whole country back to where it was. And then places in Asia like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore that have done well throughout. In Europe, unfortunately, they are now going through a second wave, but they were able to contain it when they maximized prevention and public health. So that's what we got to do right now in this state and around the country, and then keep those infections as low as possible when a COVID vaccine is made available for us. And in the meantime, research on therapeutics continues to be so critical. We've had some advances, but no cure yet. So we got to keep all those streams of activity going forward.
Dr. Ko, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Arun.
That's Dr. Harold Ko. He's the professor of the practice of public health leadership at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. You're listening and watching to a special episode of In It Together on GBH News presents Election 2020. What's next? I'm Arun Roth. Let's take a listen to some voters we caught up with earlier this week. Sorry about that. Joining me now is Michael Curry. He's the CEO and the General Counsel for the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. Michael, it's always good to speak with you. Really good to speak with you again tonight.
Excellent to be back with you, Mr. Arun.
And, you know, as we've talked about so much on this program, the virus has disproportionately impacted communities of color. That's not really up for debate. This is a big question, but looking at the roots of this, we know that the virus didn't create these disparities. It just brought them into sharper focus for many of us. What are the ways that going forward, pulling ourselves out of this, what are the things we need to look at, the root causes we need to address? Big question.
Well, yeah, it's a big question and a big answer. You know, I think the reality is I call this our national Katrina. That when Katrina hit the Gulf Coast states and particularly New Orleans, Louisiana, we should have known that the people that would desperately be sick and die from that natural disaster would be those who had transportation insecurity, right? They didn't have cars, they were food insecure, they had comorbidities and underlying conditions, that they were poor, that they were Black and brown. The reality is this is our national Katrina, and those same things are playing out with this pandemic, that this death toll, the infection rates are disparately impacting folks who are Black and brown across the country, who live in congested households, they're immigrants, they're African-American, they're Latinx. And we've never solved for the underlying issues in our health system, in our healthcare system. And this pandemic, to your question, Arun, is challenging us to get beyond just responding to the pandemic, this moment we're in, and making sure that we deal with the congested households, the essential workers who have to go into their places of work, the healthcare providers who are at most risk, as well as folks who can't stock up on supplies and that are disparately impacted by the economic conditions. So here's the challenge. Do we take this moment, make it a movement, and address the underlying issues that will make those same people most at risk for the next natural disaster, the next pandemic, or the remainder of this pandemic? And I think that's the challenge before us. Credit to the governor with the COVID-19 vaccine working group, Paul Bettinger, leading that work. Credit to Monica Burrell at DPH and the healthcare working group that she's convened the task force. Credit to our town managers and mayors like Mayor Walsh and Mayor Sullivan and Brockton. People are coming together and pulling this conversation together to figure out how do we deal with the opportunity here to deal with the systemic racism, the underlying health and equity issues, equitable distribution of a vaccine. This is a great moment if we all respond and step up, or we'll be here again.
You have to forgive me for the cynical question, but I mean, the Katrina analogy really feels like it fits, but to extend that, in our Katrina moment, you know, we had people across the country that were all of a sudden saying, oh my goodness, this looks like a third world country and not America. But Michael, after that, you know, if we were to go back and people have like check in with folks in Louisiana right now, the poor communities down there, it didn't shake people up enough for there to have been change as a result of that. So out of this, how do we make this not just a Katrina moment of realization, but a Katrina moment of action?
So, I'm a history buff, Arun, and I believe that past is prologue. So when I think about Reconstruction, in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, I think about all those 4 million slaves that were let loose with no job, no education, no health care, no access to food. And we were there trying to figure out how to respond to the underlying health conditions, and we did not respond. In fact, the country turned their backs on them for generations, and then denied them access to our hospitals and our healthcare systems through the 1960s. So we're talking about the 1800s to the 1960s. So I think about when you mentioned the lesson we should have learned in Katrina, the epiphany that folks had in that moment, the epiphany that we're having right now, how soon we forget. So we'll respond, we'll throw a little bit of money at it, we'll talk about it, we'll have conversations, and then that determines whether this is a moment or a movement, because we could change our intentions a month from now or 6 months from now, and millions of Black and brown folks will be evicted with the tsunami, the economic tsunami that's coming, right? Evictions, foreclosures, the economic tsunami that's coming with the wealth gap that was already in existence before this. Folks should go read The Color of Wealth in Boston. Now exacerbate that condition with deeper poverty, deeper debt, deeper credit crisis. We have that coming now. It's on us, right? If we don't pay attention to history and say, this is our moment to finally wipe out the taint of race and deal with the issue of poverty in this country, we will be here again. And if Americans don't care, then we'll truly get a test of whether this democracy cares for the least of us, and we'll deal with the systemic inequalities that created the poverty and the health conditions we're talking about.
So let's talk about specifically here in Massachusetts. And Michael, we have your slides if you want to make reference to those as we're talking about addressing these inequities at the community level.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'd love to pull up that first slide. Just we always talk about Arun in healthcare. There's a term called the weathering effect, and I want to talk about it in a second. But I want folks to know that there are health centers born out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The first health center in the country was in 1965, right here in Boston, in Dorchester's Columbia Point. And now a movement born out of civil rights. The caboose of the healthcare movement, of the civil rights movement, was healthcare. We were desegregating lunch counters and school systems, and then there wasn't enough focus on healthcare and the fact that people were having higher mortality and morbidity rates. And folks, really smart folks of good conscience, got together like Jack Geiger and Count Gibson and launched the health center movement with Black physicians and others across the country. And now there's 52 of them across the state, serving over 1 million patients in Massachusetts. And if you've seen one health center, you've seen one health center. I want to point out here, we talk about the weathering effect. The weathering effect is when they asked Black parents to rate their kids' asthma from 1 to 10, Black parents rated the kids' asthma 4, 5s, or 6. When the doctors rated those same kids' asthma, they were 8, 9s, and 10s. And they said to us when they were teaching us this, they said the weathering effect is when you get used to going to the ER. Me, as a kid, it was Boston City Hospital. You get used to taking the pump and popping the pill for the asthma on a regular basis. When that's not normal, you've become weathered to being sick. And I asked the question, are we weathered to these numbers? The disparate death and infection rates across the country. And these numbers that should shock our conscience, whether it's the globe, whether it's the United States, or whether it's Massachusetts, or whether it's Boston. People are sick of COVID-19, and yet people want to believe it doesn't exist, and they don't care. They're not wearing a mask, and they're not social distancing. Shame on any American that doesn't understand that public health is not about you. Public health is about us.
Michael, before we let you go, I want to ask you one other thing. There's so much we could talk about, and we're going to have to continue this on In It Together on another night. But at this particular moment where we are politically, with the votes being counted up, it's something that we talked about yesterday when we were doing our rehearsal for this. If you don't mind me mentioning this, that a lot of people, leaving aside being shocked by the polls, a lot of people were still frankly disturbed to see Donald Trump gaining as many votes that he did, running the kind of campaign that he did. That was a context in which you and I were talking about this. And I was originally going to ask you about the protests this summer and how they might have lent some more support, at least it seemed at the time, to public support to addressing these inequities. What about, is there anything that you're seeing now in the election results that gives you pause about that?
Arun, and I think you and I talked about this, I'm deeply disturbed, as probably most Americans are, but particularly Black Americans are, by the over 68 million, probably 69 million when it's all said and done, Americans who voted for Donald Trump. We knew Donald Trump was an overt racist with his casinos. We knew he was an overt racist with Central Park 5 and calling for their murder. We knew Donald Trump was a racist when he was running for office, and he explained away the racism, the overt racism of Ku Klux Klan and white Aryan folks in the country. He gives us, right? If they always say, if someone shows you who they are, believe them. And he has done a great job of showing us who they are. But then we have to ask ourselves, who are we? When 69 million people still voted for him, when he fumbled the response to COVID-19, I would argue he defunded, and I use that term intentionally, he defunded our pandemic response. And then you ask the question, where's the conscience of our country? To say, okay, we want our 401ks not to be impacted. We have an ideological debate over Roe v. Wade or women's right to choose. But then you choose a man that you know is not good for democracy. That's not good for our country. That is, quite frankly, stowing racial division in this country. I have to ask the question of everyone who voted for them, what about you? What were you thinking when you walked into that poll and you cast a vote for him, knowing where he could take this country in the next 4 years? I am terrified, Arun, as I think most Black Americans are, maybe many Americans are. This is not an ideological debate. This is not about Republicans and Democrats. We can deal with those debates, and our country survived those disagreements. This is darker than that. This is deeper than that, and that terrifies me.
Well, Michael, I hate to end on a dark note, but we're going to have to continue this conversation, and it's really good to speak with you at this very important moment. Really appreciate you taking the time with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's Michael Curry. He's a CEO and General Counsel for the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. You're listening to and watching a special episode of In It Together on GBH News presents Election 2020, What's Next? I'm Arun Roth, and we're going right now to our next guest. Joining me now is Dr. Mary Kate Miller. She's a licensed clinical health psychologist at UMass Memorial Healthcare. Dr. Miller, hi.
Hi, Arun. Thank you so much for having me on tonight.
So as you well know, and I well know as a stressed out person myself, it seems like everybody that I talk to is stressed out. The pandemic, the election, all of this stuff. Do we actually have, though, any data showing this playing out on a wider scale and the toll this might be taking on all of us?
We do. Actually, the American Psychological Association and the CDC as well have done a little bit of research to see and to compare to previous surveys in the past as to where are we as Americans right now with our stress level related to this new pandemic, in addition to different things like the election and comparing to 2016's election and how Americans felt back then. So what we do have election specific is that in 2016, 52% of Americans felt very stressed by the election in the APA survey that they sent out. And then now we see in 2020 that has risen up to 68% of Americans feel stressed by the election. On a different note, with this new pandemic, looking at some of the newer research and data that we have, both from the CDC and from APA, their surveys from APA, we found that 8 out of 10 Americans, so about 78% of Americans feel that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a significant amount of stress. So that makes sense. And when we say that we're kind of all in this together, a lot of us feel that way. Nearly 1 in 5 of Americans, adult Americans, so that's 19% in this survey, felt that their mental health was actually worsened this year at this time compared to last year, which is tough to hear. And also we are seeing from the CDC data that anxiety, depression, substance use, and new onset substance users, and also more adjustment and acute stress related symptoms are also on the rise as well.
Wow. So, can you give us any quick tips for things that we can do? Because a lot of us can't just walk away from the stress, or it's surrounding us all the time.
Right. Yeah. And you make a great point by saying we're connected all the time, which can be wonderful and also can be difficult too. So the idea of self-care is so important nowadays, with the things like news and social media playing a huge role in. It's a good thing in that we are in the know and we're knowledgeable and we can stay connected with our family and friends. Though there's another side of social media and the news that it's okay to take a break from, and it's okay to allow yourself to disconnect every so often. That can be really helpful for promoting self-care. And what self-care is that promotion of wellness and also preventing distress. So it's engaging intentionally in meaningful activities, things that can be helpful for your both physical health and mental health.
Now, it can be easier in a way to help out my family and friends when we're all quarantined together. But what about friends and family that we're distanced from, and we might be worried about how they're getting through this?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And going back to technology, that is something that allows us to stay connected if family and friends are able to use and are literate in things like Zoom, or using video calls. Even just picking up the phone and checking in on friends and family is something, or people you haven't spoken to in a while, is something that's helpful, where you can still physically distance but feel that connection, rather than feeling more isolated and lonely in your possible physical distancing area on your own.
Well, this is another conversation we could keep on. Pretty every conversation on this show, they don't end. We just sort of put them on pause. We'll come back and talk more about this, but Dr. Miller, this has been very useful. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
That's Dr. Mary Kate Miller. She's a licensed clinical health psychologist at UMass Memorial Hospital. You've been listening to a special episode of In It Together. Join us for our regular show time. That's Monday through Thursday nights from 6:30 to 7 on 89.7 FM. You can also check out the In It Together podcast, which is downloadable wherever you get your podcasts. We're not hard to find. Thanks for joining us as we ask what's next after the 2020 elections. You can find all our election coverage at WGBH.org/news, WGBH.org news/election 2020. GBH News election coverage continues tomorrow, starting early with Joe and the team on Morning Edition. Here's what else we have coming up. Tomorrow night at 7 on Beat the Press with Emily Rooney, they'll look at, among other topics, how do you cover the president making incorrect claims of voter fraud on live TV? Something we had to deal with earlier this evening. Then a special election-related Basic Black kicks off at 7:30. You will not want to miss that. You can stream that on Facebook or Twitter at Basic Black WGBH. You can also watch the shows, of course, on WGBH Channel 2. Then on Sunday, join Under the Radar with Callie Crossley at 6 p.m. Callie and guests will discuss the youth vote and how Latinx and Black communities are mischaracterized as voting blocs. Additionally, the list of people to thank for this 2-hour event would take a long time to get through, but I'd like to thank my on-air GBH colleagues, Jim Browdy, Margery EAGAN, Adam Reilly, Joe Matthew, Philip Martin, all our guests who share their time with us tonight, an army of producers and engineers, including but not limited to Annie Schreffler, Azita Garamani, Courtney Kennedy, Karen Marshall, Amanda Beeland, Lauren Lauren Joe Alejandro, Andrew Masua, Mark Manuelian, Bill Piacatelli, and David Cleckley. Our interns are Nikita Duke and Ryan Arell. Our general manager is Pam Johnston. From my basement in Lexington, have a good night. We'll talk soon.